Well, guess what? The music stopped and the whole house of cards collapsed. And the central bank, who was really responsible for the whole thing by making money so cheap to fund the scam, came in and made money even cheaper. So instead of there being any accountability, instead of there people going to jail, like William K. Black during the 1970s S&L crisis sent 1,000 bankers to jail. And what they did in America was, instead of making that particular type of fraud illegal, they simply changed the laws to make it so that it was never going to be prosecuted again. And it opened the door in the 1980s for all kinds of other scams, which then led to the 2008 crisis and the current crisis we have today. We have laws in the books, Tucker, but we don't have anyone enforcing those laws. And implied in the Sam Bankman-Fried crisis scam is none other than Gary Gensler over at the SEC, who should have been calling time on this a long ago, but we find out that he's actually involved and that there's some what I would call collusion. And the problem is, in America, you have a country that's ruled by a kleptocracy. Every institution in America is tied to Wall Street in some way. They've all been financialized. They all use cheap money. They're all cross-collateralizing each other's assets. They're all using that money to buy real assets. And they're all undermining the economy in fundamental ways, which lead to inflation, which lead to unemployment, which lead to all kinds of dysfunctions in the economy, in our medical system, in all across the institutions. It all goes back to essentially the deregulation that happened 40 years ago, which led to the financialization.
Who is smart. Why do you think he did that?
Well, later on in retirement, he said publicly that he regrets now, and he looks back and he said he was wrong, that the idea of simply throwing the keys of the castle to Wall Street, letting them do whatever they wanted to do was incorrect. But at the time, remember, Alan Greenspan was doing ads for Apple Computer, and he was a media figure.
Yes.
And so he was very egocentrically driven to have the attention drawn to him. He was not like Paul Volcker, who preceded him, who took rates up to 16 to 17% to wipe out the inflation that was the result of the Vietnam War and all the profligate spending in the U.S. So he became a celebrity. And this was the first time really you had financiers become celebrities. Flash forward to Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson and the financial crisis, where they're on the cover of Time magazine as saving the world and the 2008 crisis with Timothy Geithner was atrocious chapter in American financial history, where laws were broken and rewritten on the fly, where Hank Paulson put a gun to Congress' head and said, give us $780 billion right now, or we're going to crash the market. And the next day, the markets did start to crash, and then Congress said, oh, sorry, yeah, we'll give you your money. So they hold the Congress hostage because they can manipulate prices. It's very, very easy. My experience on Wall Street, I can tell you, way to own property outside of what they see as a very big corrupt system. Now, you had Michael Saylor on your show, who did a very great explanation about how Bitcoin beats inflation. You know, what I would add to it is that Bitcoin beats the kleptocracy. Bitcoin beats the inherent fraud and the problems in the U.S. economy, as it has now descended into what would almost be argued a permanent state of dysfunction by a captured regulators, venal, ineffective politicians, and a media, present company excluded, but a media that's also in their pocket as well. So we have really a crisis.
So I want to ask you to pause there, and I want to play you a montage that we put together that I watch even in my spare time, because it's just, this needs to be recorded somehow on the blockchain so it's never lost. This is the response to Sam Bankman-Fried, who I think, before I play this, we would both agree was like a transparent fraud, like obvious, right?
Yes.
Right. So no normal person, other than, I guess, Sequoia, would ever give money to a guy who plays video games during interviews, right? But here's how he was treated by the U.S. media, financial media.
Like the Financial Times is essentially a Bible on committing financial fraud. The Wall Street Journal is essentially the playbook on how to commit financial fraud. The typical financial media at CNBC really talk about fraud. There's nothing inherently with any integrity whatsoever in these financial markets. But to your point, with the coverage of Sam Bankman-Fried, here you have a situation where this is, by the way, Sam, his company FTX was launched the same day as Biden launched his presidential campaign. I don't know if you know that, but it was a bit of a coincidence there.
So I didn't know that, and so that would have been late 2019 at some point. So So it's now 2022. So in 3 years, he made billions of dollars. How do you do that?
Well, you do it by, as I explained a little bit earlier, so let's dig into this. After Bitcoin was created, a lot of people decided that they could come up with digital currencies that were going to be that could be used as scams. Essentially, it was very easy to create play money, and I did this myself, as I mentioned, in the 1990s when I did the Hollywood Stock Exchange. I created a virtual currency as part of that game, right? Because he's got his little cadre of drug-addled sex maniacs in the Bahamas, and he's perpetrating the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. So imagine that, the mix of Charles Manson and Bernie Madoff, and you end up with this freaky, fuzzy-haired, larcenistic criminal who's down there perpetrating the biggest fraud in history, and they're the Democrats are like, yeah, I'll take your money because we're morally in need. It doesn't matter when the money is stolen. Our moral agenda means that we can take stolen money because that's the way we are. We need to fight over there in Ukraine. We need to make all the, the moral turpitude of the Democrats is insanely over the top. So, but they've run out of money. So they had to resort to this, essentially this racket. And the racket, you can go back and you can trace the origins of it to the past few decades where we've had very similar instances of financial fraud and abuse. The 2008 crisis I mentioned, the S&L crisis, long-term capital management, if you remember that, the late 90s, they were engaged in a massive scheme, really, Ponzi scheme that blew up, and they were bailed out by the Fed. The hope is always that the Fed will bail you out. The hope is always that the financiers will bail you out, that there will be no accountability. What Bernanke did was they gave him a credit card 10 times bigger and said, just do the exact same thing. Obama, same thing. They said, we're not going to put you in jail. Obama said, don't focus on the past. Don't focus on the past. We're going to look to the future. So we're going to give the guys who committed these crimes 10 times to 20 times the credit, and they're going to do exactly the same thing. Now, at that time, we said within 10 to 12 years, the exact same thing is going to happen, but 10 times worse. And that's where we're at today. We were off by 2 years. 14 years later, it's the global financial crisis part 2. And it's because of the exact same things happening all over again. I wrote, remember collateralized mortgage-backed securities?
Very well, okay. Yes.
There's a new product just this past week. It's called private equity-backed securities. So they're taking worthless private equity, they're wrapping it in a new
I'm adding that to the list of things I'm not investing in.
No, but they've already sold, $500 million to $1 billion of it. Because...
What is it?
It's a private equity-backed note where they're taking the stubs from busted private equity deals that are completely illiquid. And that's what I said. If you read the Wall Street Journal, it's like you're reading a how-to book on how to commit fraud. Here it is. Illiquid private equity stakes bundled into a security known as a collateralized fund obligation with a high credit rating, of course, because they put a little treasury in there to give it it's like reverse drug dealing.